All right, so if you are not in a seat and want to be in a seat, come be in a seat. If you are in a seat, welcome. We're glad to continue the conversation. We've hit that point in the afternoon. We are just a touch before 4 o'clock, so well done to you if you've been here all day. Coffee and things in the back if you need to grab one as you come into the space. We just had a wonderful conversation about the role of capturing people's lives through documentaries and things of that sort. The session now is going to be exploring this question around how do we actually sustain journalism and democracy. And in so many ways, as I was listening to NPR driving to campus this morning, one of the reporters made the comment that they were telling a story and then they came back and said, and we will follow up with this because that's what we do. And as I think about the importance of journalism in a democratic society, we've been hearing it from multiple perspectives and voices for the last day and a half. This is an essential piece, whether we talk about it as the fourth estate, we talk about it as a means of local information for communities to be informed and engaged, as we heard in a prior session. So really looking forward to the perspectives that will come from this discussion. Again, following in a similar format to others, this will be a moderated discussion and some space on the back end for Q&A. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Danilo Yanich.
Thank you, Tim. Good to see everybody again from up here. When we talked about this panel, the idea was to consider many of the themes that we've been talking about throughout the course of the day in a larger context. That is, the title of the summit is Media and Democracy. And so the question is, what's the relationship? We take it for granted that there is a relationship there. But I was talking with the folks here before. A quote from Bill Kovach and Tom Rosenstiel in their book, Blur. At the end of the book, they were talking about, now that we've told you about how concerning the media system is, what do we do, what steps do we take as individuals in this in this media environment? And they came up with a notion called skeptical knowing. It's a bunch of questions, same like John McManus talked about the smell test. But at the end of that, at the end of the book, and if you think that you didn't have much responsibility in doing the things, this skeptical knowing about the information you get. I tell my students all the time, that someone tells you something, you say, well, how do you know? 95% of what you know over the course of a day is mediated. That is to say, you do not have firsthand information about it. So you have to make some decisions about the information you get. And Kovach and Rosenstiel said that a democracy stakes everything on an informed citizenry. We stake everything on it. And so the folks that are here have done a good deal of work and a good deal of thinking about that relationship. Josh Shepperd is right to my left from the University of Colorado. Josh Scacco is on the far stage left from the University of South Florida. Mark Eichmann is right next to Josh from WHYY, and Jeralynn Miller is from NPR, and she's also an alumna here. Okay. In any event, I will ask them, essentially, like I said to them, is tell us what you do. Josh Shepperd just had a piece published in The Conversation 2 days ago, and his take on funding NPR and that defunding process. Anyway, so as Josh Scacco would say, we're going to begin with the historian.
Okay. So, democracy. So that's a pretty hard one. When it comes to media, democracy comes out of two sources, I think. So one is interstate commerce and the idea that there's an exchange that's national between the states, and the other that there's a public service component that increases equal access to education. So if we're going to think about media in the 20th century and why we have national journalism and why we have the institutions that support it, typically it points to early policies and early institutions that were focused on creating equal access. So most media and journalism infrastructure came out of education and public education. And so the idea that there'd be a compulsory education in which you had to go to school, you had to have access to information, begins to synthesize with the invention of modern mass media around the 19-teens. And really by the 1920s or so, there's a concept that everyone deserves to be able to go to school no matter where they live. So rural areas, new immigrants to the country during the progressive era, and technology was seen as the solution to the problems of training and trade with national commerce, and then equal access to that trade. And so a lot of the infrastructure that we now dwell within comes out of a mixture of business and public education. And so when we get to something like NPR, or we get to something like PBS, largely its mission statement, and the reason it even exists, is based upon the concept of equal access to information and equal access to education. And so without those things, it has a completely different mission statement. So it's a mission statement-based form of mediation. And so when you have a mission statement that precedes the actual practices, it's fundamentally different than commercial media. And so without that mission statement, there actually isn't a lot of reason for NPR and PBS to exist, and there's also not a reason for democratic journalism to exist. So the idea that there'd be a concept that precedes an action or a contribution is fundamental to democratic journalism. And so I think that's the moment that we're in. We're in the moment in which the concept is attempting to be stripped from our non-commercial institutions by a current regime. And so we have to fight for ideas sometimes, too. It can't just be that it's a job. Without the idea, there's actually not a lot in between the free markets and the ideas of democratic practice.
Can I follow that a bit with Josh Scacco? We were preparing for the panel, that I'll ask Jeralynn and Tom. When we were preparing for the panel last week or so, Josh was talking about the larger threats, the larger environment in which this is all happening. And also, you might want to talk, Josh, about your center. So that's how this comes about too, okay?
So I'm not the media historian here. If you want to know about media history, you ask Josh Shepperd. So that Josh is the historian. I direct a center at the University of South Florida, the Center for Sustainable Democracy. And one of the things that we're trying to understand and grapple with at this moment is that it's not only just these episodes of particular targeting of news outlets, whether that is NPR or PBS, but we have to be thinking about these things within the larger theme of what's going on. For the students in the room, your professors are getting emails from their administration related to the classes that they teach, the research that they conduct, the activism that their students engage in the classroom. And that is happening from the federal level and the federal government in Florida. It's been happening from state government for the past several years, now on top of it with the federal government. So higher education institutions are also being targeted at this moment, just as media outlets are. You can also look at, for instance, civil society organizations like Habitat for Humanity. Yes, Habitat for Humanity. Are being targeted by the federal government. And part of this is understanding sort of what is the broader framework of thinking through if a system is moving from democratic processes to more authoritarian processes, one of the things that needs to happen is the leadership in that government has to find ways to not only consolidate power within government, but also find ways to consolidate power within society. And consolidation of power within society means looking at the independent sources of information and content outside of political leadership. So the higher education professionals that are conducting research, the news organizations that are putting out information to the public, civil society organizations that are looking at how to support communities. And the whole idea is you weaken each one of these aspects in society so that what's left at the end of it is a leader or set of leaders that have consolidated power not only within government, but also within broader society as well. And so I think we need to be thinking about this broader sort of conversation here, this campaign that's not just has NPR and PBS in its sights, but has the federal government, for instance, threatening the licenses through the Federal Communication Commission of news outlets as well. We need to be thinking about the challenges to our civil society organizations and nonprofits at this moment as well, and understand that each one of these is in a broader theme. It's in a broader sort of knitted fabric. Each one of these things does not exist by itself. And so while we're talking about journalism and democracy here, it exists within a broader framework of what we're talking about in the United States related to democratic backsliding, the erosion of democratic rights and liberties that we're seeing at the federal level and at the state level as well.
Then to Tom and Jeralynn about how you're functioning within the media within the media sphere of Josh's comments.
Yeah, for me, I think from both the Joshes, this is sort of to your thoughts about sort of the mission of what we're on. So I work at WHYY, where I'm editor. We have an office in Wilmington, and then I also split time in Philadelphia. And being in journalism and considering being in the profession at this time in history, I think is a super important place to be, especially because of the mission that Josh was kind of talking about. The importance of that has really come into laser focus of what we do really matters and how we do it really matters. So kind of the perspective of us at WHYY is to really continue and get better at telling the stories that we tell, and deciding to, you were saying everything's kind of mediated, your experience is mediated in the information you get. The importance of deciding what stories get told now versus what stories can't be told, because of time constraints, and they were talking a couple of panels ago of financial restraints and sort of you can't get to everything you want to, but getting to the things you can and deciding on what those things are is more important than ever, especially to try to rebuild and reconstruct, trust in media in general, but specifically to us, trust in our reporters that are in the community and trying to tell stories that matter, but also stories that connect to people who live in that community. And I think it's just so much more important now. Pressure is not the right word. It's more important now than it's ever been. So I think it's something we really focus on every day to get it right and make sure we're talking to everyone we can.
Well, hi, I'm Jeralynn Miller here with NPR, but as a fundraiser, as a practitioner. Is this on? Yeah, okay. And I really like how you started us off, Josh, in terms of the public service mandate and the mission-based work. When I think a lot about democracy, I think it's all about participation. One of the ways that we ask people to participate, especially here in the United States, is to support things that they care about, right? And I think we're in a moment right now, whether at NPR or anywhere else, where we might have to fill some gaps, right, between what's being stripped away, whether it's federal funding or other revenue models or pieces going away, with gifts from donors, right? So I am here as a fundraiser, but I build relationships. Last night on the stage, Domenico and Ested talked very much about getting into community as journalists and, you know, creating trust with people, Mark, what you just mentioned. On the same sort of a different side of that, I guess, is finding the dollars to support it, right? So the work we do at NPR covers everything from $1 gifts to $1 million plus gifts, but the work is the same across that. You know, where are we connecting with people if you're starting as a newsletter subscriber, or if you find us via Tiny Desk? We want to meet you where you are. We want to let you know why it's important that you're here. We want to educate you on the mission of what NPR is and the work that we do, and ultimately connect what we hope you see as impact and as something that provides value in your community, and get you to support that.
Given the market model that we have for the production of news and information, and the title of the panel is Sustaining Journalism, not sustaining democracy, but sustaining journalism, presumably that it extends. In the context of this market, in the context of this system that we have now to produce journalism, to what extent is that system conducive to sustaining journalism, to sustain journalism that it would indeed support democracy? These are huge questions, I know, but we haven't talked about. But I you know, we've talked. This is all talked around it. Okay, everything that we talk about. You know, see people where they are, and so build trust. Okay, but why? What? You know, what's the larger context in which this operates? And if we're operating in this system, this private system, this market system, to deliver news and information, whether it's legacy media or social or social media, that's the market is still operating, right? So given that, where do you think we are, or where do we go?
I'll talk a little bit about this. I started to talk a little bit about impact, right? I think one of the things we do as fundraisers is try to provide a sense of how did we steward your dollars appropriately? You know, do you see and sort of feel this impact? I think a challenge that I talk about a lot with a place like NPR, WHYY, any of our member stations, is that we work at the pace of news, right? So we always have to be pivoting and available and aware of what's happening around us, which is great, except for the news cycle changes so quickly. So when I think about sustaining journalism, I actually think about the long term, and I do think a big challenge for us is finding ways to sort of creatively stay ahead of and in step with our audience, who hopefully become our donors and support the work. But that's a big challenge of what's ahead. I mean, since last Thursday, I will share very candidly, we've been very busy in NPR's fundraising team trying to help people understand just what this moment means and hopefully galvanize support around it. But that's, I think, doesn't exactly answer your question, but I think it's a big challenge of what's ahead.
So I'll also say that we can think of this in some ways of the news that you consume, or if I look around at a lot of the students you don't consume, potentially, what is it preparing you for? So if we think about this in the sense of we oftentimes bring particular assumptions to the table as people about what a democracy is. But the interesting thing is when you look at the public opinion data, there isn't even consensus among the American public on what is democracy. Some people think it is about voting and the sort of like participatory elements of petitioning and protesting and those particular types of things. Your professor right in the front, Tim, would say that it's deliberation. Deliberation's like one of those key components. The conversations are important. Not only that, but like the tone and tenor of those conversations are really important. The civility components of that. And in some ways, journalists might work for the participatory components in terms of pushing people to engage in particular actions, for the types of components that encourage conversations amongst people. There is also, though, there is also a school of thought that talks about pluralistic democracy. The idea that democracies are best when group interest is fostered, when conflict is fostered. And in many ways, if we think about those particular types of things, one particular component there is how groups are empowered to consider their own identities, their own perspectives, before they go into those conversations and confront differences in those things. How are people equipped in themselves and in the groups that are like them to then go and have conversations with people who are different from them? And if we think about, in a lot of ways, journalism on that front, all you need to do is you can talk to individuals in many communities who might say they feel overlooked. In last evening's panel, or in the conversation last night, there was talk about communities oftentimes feel overlooked. The only time they see a journalist is when crime occurs in a community, or they might be completely invisible altogether in the pages or in the frames of the news. So how are communities being served if there aren't any journalists or reporters actually in those communities providing information to them to begin with? So I think we need to be thinking about this from a broader perspective, in the sense of like, journalists probably come to the table with very different conceptions of what democracy is too, and very different priorities there. And so thinking through what our expectations are, I think, will be very important then for understanding, do journalists have those as well?
And I think we come to this time, like this point in time, like you said last week, it's sort of like the alarm bells are going off for like, oh my gosh, like this is kind of an emergency. But I think the response, and yes, there has to be a immediate response, especially for all of us, really. But it's a long game, right? It's like building back the trust to the community who hasn't seen a reporter except for when somebody was shot on the corner. Building back trust in that community doesn't take, the week after follow-up. It's a long game. Something at WHYY we've been trying to do with the help from Corporation for Public Broadcasting over the last, 2 years now, is really invest in Southern Delaware, where it's a fairly news desert to a point. And Johnny Perez-Gonzalez, who was on a panel earlier this morning, UD grad, and WHYY Delaware reporter, has been focusing over the last 2 years on the area where he grew up in Georgetown, and talking to people who live there who don't even speak English and would never really read WHYY news copy online, and trying to connect with them and tell their story. And I think it's we've seen success in defining success as sort of telling good stories that resonate with people who live in that community, and that's success for us. And I think that's tiny steps in the direction of supporting democracy by telling stories of people whose stories aren't told. We've had great partners in that with Hoy in Delaware, and the work that they do to try to to partner with them, and they've been a great partner in that effort to translate stories and set up public events where we can talk to folks just about what they're thinking and what they want journalism to be, what they want us to cover. And so I think it's those little steps, and that's not gonna solve them, save democracy tomorrow. But I think it's those tiny steps in that direction to serve the mission, Josh, that you talked about earlier, that we have to take, and we have to. And I'm really proud that we've been able to do that, even if it's just putting one finger in the dam that's leaking. We're putting our fingers in the dam.
Okay. So the idea that lies behind the formation of a media industry, so the thing that funds and then allows for the possibility of journalism, the shape that's taken in advance of the practice will dictate the kinds of content that it produces. So if you have like a media industry that's sponsorship based, which is great, most of the great innovations in aesthetics historically come out of the private media industry, and they're looking to create content, then they can reach a niche audience or a wide audience or lowest common denominator, least objectionable programming audience, which was the 1950s way of looking at audiences before they had certain kinds of survey research. But if you reverse that and you think about it as beginning with the concept of democracy, for example, and how that might lead to other practices, historically in this country, you begin to see like a growth of an interconnectivity between the states in which they're exchanging programs that they think best reaches certain educational audiences, best underserved audiences. It kind of grows into a distribution network. And actually the media industry itself for public media in this country emerged out of the concept, and it grew out of fidelity to the concept more than it was an industry that created content. So I'll put it a little bit differently. When you have an idea about how democracy should look, historically, it's not a should question, but historically it has led to certain kinds of innovations and practices that have given us, for example, most cable content. You have like the History Channel or Discovery Channel or these kinds of different groups. Even MTV to some extent in the old days came out of this. And so the idea that we would want to begin with a profit logic or begin with a way to make money actually precludes lots of types of innovation in content production. So I'll put it a little bit differently one more time, which is to say there's like three kind of non-commercial models, and it depends what the interests are for the types of content that's created. So the first that we were kind of generally talking about is public. And public media, I've argued, comes out of education. It's a public education model that became, so home economics broadcasts in the very old days, the 1920s, became cooking shows. Professors talking into a microphone to an audience and doing lectures became public affairs. Almost all of our genres came out of the idea that everyone deserves equal education. And then they started adding entertainment to it. So a second model, actually, in the late 40s is community media, which is that anyone can kind of have access to a mic if they're volunteering over time. So I love community media. It's not as polished, and the aesthetics aren't quite as strong usually, although they are sometimes, as public media or as commercial media. But you really get a sense of what the community thinks about itself talking to itself. And to me, that's fundamentally democratic, at least in aspiration. And then the final one, which is I think where we're going, if current politics has its way, is what we call state-based media. And there's a lot of examples of this around the world, which is to say that the state dictates the information. It's propaganda, right? So that's still a non-commercial model in its own funny way. So we have to be careful of saying that non-commercial media is in itself solely a good. But when you look at the trajectories of how ideas about social relations should look, affect the practices, you actually see a different kind of innovation than the sponsorship model historically. And I think like new creator culture is actually, through sometimes commercial distribution models, is still kind of re-innovating that in some ways. And I know there's a podcasting thing coming up. Podcasting, one of the great beauties of what my colleagues in public media do is they're supposed to reach the smallest tangible audience, right? Since there's no profit motive, every audience counts. Everyone counts in a democracy, we hope, right? That's one of the goals. So the idea that podcasting can actually, with the non-appointment listening, you can actually reach the small audiences again. you can actually make a podcast that's only supposed to reach a couple hundred people, because that is actually the constituency or the discourse that's associated with it. There's something really, I think, brilliant about that, and in some ways the best is yet to come for non-commercial media aesthetically because of that.
I want to make one note, just to distinguish some things here. There's a difference between, I think, as Josh is saying, but I want to put a fine point on it for all of you, that there's a difference between state media and publicly funded media. They're very different. And the reason why I say that is publicly funded media is partly or wholly, in some cases, depending on country, funded via taxpayer dollars as well as other means. But there are mechanisms in place that separate the programming, the news gathering, the news production process from government officials. That there's some firewalls that exist, regulatory things in place to make sure that the news remains independent of government influence. State-based media does not have that firewall. And the way you can kind of think about this is, I'm sure many of you in the room use TikTok on a regular basis. TikTok's been in the news the past couple months because the U.S. government is trying to figure out, what to do with TikTok. But one of the proposals that's been floated by the federal administration in Washington, D.C., is for the U.S. government to buy a stake in TikTok, to actually buy a component of it in the final deal. Now, if there were regulations that were put in place to protect the information that you would see, the content that you would see on TikTok from influence by the federal administration, that would be one type of publicly funded media. However, if those firewalls are not in place, and then government officials, for instance, can influence the content on that platform, you then have a version of state media. That's the big difference in terms of the defining line. And so Josh's point about movement in the direction potentially of state media is actually very real. And all you have to do is look at the app that's probably on most of your phones in this room.
Okay. I still want to go back to the ad-based system, but because most of the system is ad-based, right? I mean, but this is a commercial enterprise, so most of the system is ad-based. If that is the case, how does it change? Let me try to form that question well. If that is the case, how is it possible for that system to modify its ways to support the journalism we talk about that's fundamental to democracy? Because what we've seen over the last 20 years at least, right, is the diminution of that. And so it's fine for the public funded media. I'm worried about that system, because it makes its case that it's doing things that would sustain democracy for the community and so on and so forth. All right. What can it modify itself to serve this purpose, do you think? Or is that ship presently constructed by virtue of what it understands it should do, and then it produces information based on that construction? Can it change, do you think? Because that's the argument. On the consolidation side, I hear this every day. On the consolidation side, you're hearing media firms saying, no, we have to consolidate in order to protect journalism. Okay? We have to consolidate to protect journalism because we have to be able to do this enterprise reporting and so on. But I don't see it, at least in my research, I don't see the evidence of that. Okay? But this FCC and the Congress I think we'll go some steps to further consolidate. I hope that's clear enough. Okay, all right.
I think it is. I just want to jump in. I don't know if it's helpful to hear, but NPR, when we look at sort of our revenue model, it's a couple different things, right? It's not just fundraising exclusively. It's fundraising plus sponsorship, which is run out of a different entity entirely, NPM. And then it's also our member partner support. So what's interesting to me about maybe the question you ask is not do we have to change? Something you just mentioned is a firewall. We're very intentional, especially on the fundraising side, certainly on the sponsorship side. There are rules as guided by the FCC that they're following. On the fundraising side, we make it very clear that donor dollars do not equal journalism. You know, there's not anyone influencing our stories. So all I'm thinking about as I hear your question is there are a lot of different levers that perhaps we can pull to help us make our work more sustainable. A lot of the solution sometimes is, oh, if that piece of funding over here is going away, the fundraisers will make it up, right? It's difficult, the work that we do. We're relationship builders. It can take a lot of time to build support from groups of donors. And if you want it to last, mostly we need time, we need reach, we need audiences that, again, grow into engaged donors. And so to answer your question, I don't know that we need to change. I think our levers need to be plentiful so we can keep pulling them to keep up. But I think, we want to be very careful about how that influences the work. We support the work, but we don't then make it.
Part of it, part of the answer is almost on viewership, right? Like the viewers determine what the ad rates are going to be and what the networks will put on, right? So the more people that watch X news show, the more of that they'll produce because the more ads they're selling because more people are watching it, right? So,
Yeah.
so part of the equation is, yes, do our best journalism, but in a democracy, it's up to the people to decide what they will consume, what they will view, and then sort of what gets replicated.
Yeah, Tom, I see where you're going with that, but I think that ratings is a blunt instrument, right? Okay, it's a very blunt instrument. And so if you're looking at local television news, for example, folks will say, yes, you have choices. Channel 1, Channel 2, Channel 3 in a market. The problem is you don't have any alternatives. They look the same, right? And that's my worry. Because the claim now in front of the FCC and the National Association of Broadcasters and others who want to make it much less restrictive is that we need to do this in order. No one's saying we need to make money. God forbid, you would not say that now, although you say that to your shareholders when you're talking about consolidation. So what I'm looking at is to say is that that's still the largest section of our media system that's profit-based. And I'm asking again whether or not you think it's possible that there are changes there to sustain. That's let me give you a real quick thing, really quick. We were doing some research on duplication, and some years ago, and we called the stations. As soon as we called the stations to say what we were doing. We said who we were, and we were looking at content. And I was looking at this notion of simulcasting, meaning what you're going to do is simulcast the exact same content at the exact same time on at least 2 stations. So we call a news director in Jacksonville, Florida. What he did not know is we had access to his content by virtue of archival work. We knew what they were doing, but we wanted to talk with the news director about it. And so a student was next to me. I said to him, sir, who I was, we were doing this, and we understand, do you do any simulcasting? We're trying to check with each of the stations. And he said to me, I don't know what simulcasting is. I said, well, okay, it's broadcasting the same stuff at the same time. How's that? And he said, no, I've been in the business for 15 years, and we have never done that. What he did not know is I was looking at the simulcast. And Zena said to me, but he lied. Yes, he did. And so I worry about that model of journalism, local journalism, that doesn't see that it might have some effect on the information that citizens need. And I don't know whether or not any suggestion to him that maybe simulcasting, that of course he does not do, right? Okay, that maybe that might not serve us well. That's my question. I don't know that system can help us here. All right.
I've got a quick thing to say, which is that, the job of a business is to recoup its investment. I mean, that's it, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's good. It's good for them, and it's good to keep the system going for them. So what have they done over time? So you mentioned ratings. So they've essentially created a model of demography that they know who's going to respond to what stimuli in what way over time. And so the entire system is based upon predication of behavior. And so we have a system that essentially is based around like a behavioral science that then creates content that they know in advance that will respond with some repetition based upon who we're most like. And that's the system. There is nothing else. And we are categories, right? So there's no individuals or agencies within these kind of modeling. There is only the prediction of behavior in response to content that will lead to certain types of purchasing, political decisions, or affective responses, like emotionally. And so then the question is, well, how does that serve a niche audience or a discourse? So does that serve an intended target audience? And then a lot of consumer activism now is based around, well, my target audience affiliation is not being served. But it doesn't actually change the system. So like the commercial model that we're all immersed within understands democracy as reaching the most possible affiliations for the most repetition of responses. And so when you have like a journalistic model that is imbued or is reliant upon the ability to predict in advance behavior, it's not necessarily inherently democratic from an institutional perspective. That doesn't mean that journalists aren't completely invested in democracy and that the model's not invested in that. So I think like the current American, at least, media industry model is just to reach as many audiences as possible, and then that's how we mobilize labor. And in some ways it's like a miracle that they keep recouping their money after putting so much money up front. But I think like the challenge for the future journalists coming up is can you uncategorize yourself and make ethical adjudications within that, or can we re-find the alternatives that used to be present until really the last 20 years by which an idea can regulate behavior more than an affiliation or something like that. And by affiliation, I mean consumer affiliations. Not that, okay, thanks.
Let me first of all apologize. I called Mark Tom. I was talking with Tom, but I apologized to him, maybe, so I apologize.
We can also think about this if we're getting out of like, the business kind of decision level and those types of things to then the reporter and the journalist level. There's also significant challenges at that level as well in terms of particularly at the local level. I mean, it's not, if you're a local reporter, a local journalist, you're not getting paid that much. So there's that particular part. But beyond that, then there's also important questions about what journalists know about democracy and what they don't know. So here's an example, which is one of the challenges of news reporting on what happened at the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021 was, for news outlets, was how to describe it. So you had news outlets calling, protesters storming the Capitol a riot, an insurrection. A few folks out there called it an attempted coup d'etat. So there was a very large spectrum of frames that were used, each of them evoking very different meanings for people. But the problem is deeper than just the label. The problem is that in the coverage, oftentimes, and you saw this in local reporting, local reporters would talk about this as an interruption of the peaceful transfer of power, which is the hallmark of a democracy. Well, there was one problem, which is they didn't explain why peaceful transfers of power matter. They just went with the statement. Peaceful transfers of power are the hallmark of a democracy. For many people who maybe haven't had civics in decades, or maybe didn't even have civics at all in some places in the United States, there's no context for why a peaceful transfer of power matters. So this is, I think, actually an important, when I now have talked with journalists about this, when I talk with students about this, I ask them first, well, why does a peaceful transfer of power matter? So I'm posing this question to you all. I'm not using it as a rhetorical question. Why does a peaceful transfer of power matter in a democracy? Why? Anyone want to shout out an answer? Okay, so first big one is community safety. Because the transfer of power from one political leader to another, or one set of leaders to another, if it's not peaceful, the opposite is violent. People get beaten up, people die. So what happened on January 6th? People died. So there's a community safety aspect of it. There's also a second big component, which we don't really talk about, which is really the 2020 election ended on January 6, 2021. The ratification of the Electoral College votes in Washington, D.C. is the end of the election. It's the actual end of the election. So it fulfills the voices of what 160, 165, 170 million people did. It doesn't just end on election day. You would find in the minority of coverage in news stories explanations for why a peaceful transfer of power matters. So ultimately what you get is then you get, the former president who then became president saying, oh, it was a peaceful day, it was fantastic, right? Because so many different conceptions, also people don't know why a peaceful transfer of power matters. So you can rely on it basically saying, oh, yeah, it was a little bit different from usual, but no biggie, it's fine. That context matters, and oftentimes for journalists, they don't supply the context. And part of it might be, maybe it gets cut by editors, I'm pointing at you as an editor, or they don't know to supply the context because they themselves don't know why a peaceful transfer of power matters. So those are some other big challenges just at the reporter level and the journalist level.
Let's go to those challenges that Josh was talking about. What do you run into? What do you run into with it?
Yeah, I think part of the problem, or not a problem, but part of the challenge is the time challenge, right? We develop as reporters and yes, as editors, shorthand, right? For this is just the way it's. We couch big events
Of democracy.
right. We couch big events in a phrase or two to stand in for this huge historic event. It gets like 4 words, right? So that's certainly a challenge, and yes, that happens in public media too. I wish I could say, oh, that's only a commercial media problem. But yeah, that's certainly a challenge, and finding. So I'm working right now, and was typing over here earlier today, our coverage of the look back at the MOVE bombing in Philadelphia, which is 40 years next week, And we've had long discussions about how, I don't know how familiar everybody is with MOVE, but the city of Philadelphia dropped a bomb on a row house and it burnt. 11 people died and like 67 row homes burned down in like 1985. So we're trying to figure out, how do you describe this group MOVE that sort of defies definition intentionally? So we've had long conversations about what that phrase will be. Move a blah, blah, blah. And the solution that we've come to, and I'm glad I've had this experience based on your comment, is a longer definition than we looked at what everybody else is using, and it just doesn't hit the mark. So we've had to go with a longer phrase that's clunkier than I would like that phrase to be, a black liberation group or a radical anti-police group or whatever you want that phrase to be, just doesn't hit all the mark. So we've had to go, and it's like, it's 2 lines on the page. But that's what we've had to do to get it right. And so that's kind of the decisions that we've had to make, and it doesn't make it costs time, and time is precious at times on the radio, especially, less so online, of course, but it's a long phrase to read through. But yeah, that's kind of there's push and pull there to get that right.
What's the phrase?
It's too long for me to remember what we came up with this morning.
Okay, okay. No, but it's interesting that...
If you want to know, I can tell you.
Yeah.
But I think this is an interesting conversation, because all we have to do is look back at, probably some folks in the room were relatively young or not born yet on September 11th. But for multiple hours on September 11th, after the Twin Towers were attacked, we did not, as a nation, we didn't hear from the President of the United States. The reason why is because he was somewhere in an undisclosed location, somewhere in Air Force One, flying above, the United States. They couldn't get him. They didn't want to put him on the ground because of the threat. And what was happening was news media, journalists declared it an act of war before the President of the United States did. Now, I want you to remember, then the President gets on the ground, gives a speech. Journalists have basically been calling this an act of war for 2 hours. So what's his choice but to go out there and be like, this is an act of war? So it seems like the power of definition there was pretty immediate. I think, we could look at it and say it's a lot easier when it's foreign individuals who don't look like a lot of people in the United States, and it's easier to give that tag to it than it is when it's our own community and our own government doing it to its own citizens. It seems like we get very vexed about how do we define our own behavior as opposed to what the others and the outsiders do to us.
Thank you, Josh, and everybody here. We'll open it to questions from the audience. So there's one. There are a couple. There was John. There's one.
I thought it might be useful to introduce a couple of perspectives from 2 professors of the same name with slightly different spelling. Victor Picard, just up the street at University of Pennsylvania, has written extensively saying that the market model has failed democracy. It basically is broken. It's a market collapse, as he would term. And the other is Robert Picard, and he's a media economist, and he said that never has a population supported journalism. It's always needed subsidy, and the subsidy might come from advertisers, as in our model, or it might come from the government or the king or the emperor, or however it was done, but that people have never flocked to support journalism adequately, and he was pessimistic that they ever would, although I hope he's wrong. But to go back to Josh's question, it's not just that the peaceful transfer of power, if you abandon that, you basically move into you invite violence. But there's a moral issue here too. You're essentially repudiating the idea that the people's voice is sovereign, and you're basically saying might makes right. That is a complete repudiation of the concept of democracy. So from a moral perspective, it's fundamentally wrong and destructive, and it also it encourages violence.
I don't think that was a question. Okay, so I'm going to ask my question now. I guess my curiosity as a young person who hasn't been around the block for too long is whether you feel we are at kind of a inflection point in like the public dissatisfaction with the market, like just the way our society exists. Like, has it always been this way, or is what's happening right now something new? And if that's the case, like, which I feel like it kind of is, what do we do?
Historian?
That's a tough one. So I would say, okay, we call these Josh seconds when I teach, where I need like a second to like spin around. So has this historically happened? I mean, so there was cases in the 20s with the Depression, and then in the 60s with social unrest, the emergence of a number of important rights movements that have used media all along. The difference now, I think, is the extremity of the immediacy that everyone experiences with media, and then the immediacy being tied to information bubbles. And so the fact that, you know, this is an old concept in communication studies where people deliberate with their associated peoples, right? So we think, when we're thinking about ourselves and what we think, we're thinking, what would our priests say? What would our parents say? These kind of things. They call that a two-step flow. But the idea that the two-step flow could be a stranger of an anonymous account on 4chan or something like that, or that it could only be that one channel that we have. I think that this is fomenting a kind of confusion about self, and that we are not challenging ourselves to even go to our own communities anymore. We just kind of presume within a shifting landscape how shifting messaging is actually holding primacy over our own deliberations. So I think like the simple act of like critical thinking about information and being willing to triangulate information oneself, it goes a pretty long way. And I think that's obviously what students in this room would do as journalists in training. Do I think it's going to lead to a further kind of unrest? I don't think anything is ever really worse than before. I think things change and we interact differently, and then we adjust. And I think that the politics are worse right now. That's my personal opinion. I think it's more. But I think that the messaging models are changing how we interact, and that this is like kind of a transitional time, and that the new models will be fine when people are born acclimated into it, or they've always been acclimated into it. It'll just seem like that's the natural model. What we're seeing, I'm Gen X, I'm an Xennial or whatever, and we go around the border. So like for me, like we had AOL, you know, when I was a kid. It was like the first internet access was $20 an hour just to get on the internet. And so I've kind of like been in that group, which a lot of us probably are, where we've lived through all the changes as it's happening. And I think that there is a tangible change in who we bring close and how we bring them close through technology, but I don't think that's good or bad. And I think that that's kind of what we're working out right now. So maybe that's an elliptical answer.
Can I respond to the other part of your question, though? You said, what do we do now? Which is such an important question. As somebody who's here as both a practitioner in the nonprofit space, but also an alum of the Biden School, keep asking questions and keep going. I mean, I think personally that there's going to be a really big role for the nonprofit sector to play in whatever comes next and any of these next steps. And there are real careers in this space. There are a myriad of roles in the nonprofit sector. And my small soapbox that I will get on is that I came back to school to get my master's in public administration because I was in nonprofits run by incredibly passionate people who had no idea how to run a business. And nonprofits doesn't mean don't make a profit. It means the profit that you make gets put back into your mission and to the staffs that make your mission whole and make it run. So I would say don't discount, I think, the role that a public sector and a nonprofit sector has to play in this moment.
To make sure that we're not over, oh, 5, okay, I was just making sure I didn't see where it is. Good with the other responses to that? Other questions? Yes.
I'm actually from Southern Delaware, and it is a news desert. So thank you for any efforts that you are making to rectify that. You've mentioned, we know that funding for NPR and for PBS is being questioned right now. I grew up watching PBS and I listened to NPR, but I also have an elderly parent who is talking, when you talk about groups who feel like their voices are not being heard, that can be socioeconomic groups, but it can also be generational groups. And one of the arguments being made in favor of these funding cuts is that public media tends to represent one set of views much more than another. And if the goal of public media is to give voters in a democracy or citizens in a democracy the information that they need, and yet people feel like it only represents one side, then why are they supporting that? What would you say to maybe a generation, or just maybe a different socioeconomic group, but people who feel like that, not necessarily because they're part of an ethnic community, but because ideologically they are in a different place? What would your response be to people who felt like they don't disagree with the idea that public media should exist, but they are not feeling represented by it?
Good question. Yeah, and I hope you'll read Johnny's work in Southern Delaware. It's good stuff. Yeah, I think, I would just point to the work. Like, especially on a local level, I feel like it's almost harder on a national scale, and I won't speak for NPR, but like for what we do and the things that come across my desk and the stuff that Johnny reports and the other reporters that we have, I would point to it as, I would point to the work, that the stories that we tell are across a broad spectrum of socioeconomic communities as well as the political spectrum. Yeah, that's sort of my response to, here's what the stories that we've told, and, the laser focused criticism that's been magnified in recent years, but it's always kind of been hanging around. But the louder it gets, the more it kind of inspires me to make sure that my T's are crossed and my I's are dotted when it comes to that kind of thing. So it makes me do a better job, and that's what we'll do.
We have time for one more question. I didn't want to wait. It's here. There we go.
Hey, everybody. I walked in a few minutes late, so I apologize if this was touched upon before I got in. But again, going off of what was said over there, I know that NPR's funding is also in question because of the executive order. And I just wanted to ask how these cuts, if they went through, would affect your organizations, and then what do you think this says about where our democracy is heading? And then, like, what are the implications for low-income people who rely on these public media organizations for news and entertainment, like, moving forward?
I'll take the first half of that as sort of where like, for an organization like WHYY, which is a NPR PBS affiliate based in Philadelphia, but also an office in Wilmington that I work out of, it's much less of an impact than it would be for a station in Erie, Pennsylvania, that's a much smaller market and depends much more on federal funds than we do. Not that it won't be something that we have to work around and move stuff around and ask for support from our members to look at the threat that we're under and the things that are being said about the work that we do that they know very well, and present that case to them to say, will you support us more? And to people who are able to but have not yet supported us, make that a new pitch to fill in some of those gaps. But it's much less painful for us than it would be for those much smaller stations, especially you know, in other places I know out west where they're much smaller operations, a much smaller audience and donor base, where it's much more difficult. And that's where that's where it's also more important for the folks who have a low income and are more dependent on that for their you know, entertainment and education programming. It affects them more, and unfortunately it's more important for them in that area, so it's sort of a double whammy for those folks.
Unfortunately, we have to leave it there, but thank you for your questions. Thanks to Josh and Mark and Jeralynn and Josh. Thanks very much.